politician and his inevitable successful run for the presidency. And then he shows up to the town council that night, and as it turns out, everyone is on the town council. And I felt a little bit like that. But I think, to tie it back here, that the context we place the stories we tell in matters. And here, I think the stakes are a little higher than an episode of Newhart. When we read Jesus' parables, the stakes demand intentional observation. Who we see ourselves as in the parable has great consequences for how we interpret it. And in our reading today, I think the question of identity is the pivot about which the entire enterprise turns. The easiest reading of the parable is to say that we are the one sheep and Jesus is the shepherd who comes running after us. In this reading, the parable becomes a story about how extravagant God's love is. About how no matter how hard we try, no matter how far we run, God desires relationship with us and will go to any lengths to find us. This isn't a bad reading. I think God does want a relationship with all of us. I think there is nothing we can do to stop God from running after us. I think God's love is dramatic and extravagant, and I do think God rejoices every time we come home. But I also think that this is a lazy reading. For starters, the sinners in verse 1, the sinners who are usually identified with the one sheep or the lost coin, these aren't just people who have sinned in a general sense. This word here refers to people who are devoted to sin, people who are defined by their sin. Those whose sin renders them unfit for society. I don't think that describes anyone here. Further, this reading is too easy. I know there are times in my life and in the lives of people I love where a message like this, a message of God's boundless and dramatic love, would be one of profound consolation. I even think that that may have been the message Jesus was giving to those same tax collectors and sinners he was eating with. But when I read these stories, that reading leaves me unsatisfied. I think there's something deeper. Another way of reading this would be to say that we are the shepherd, or the woman in this scenario. That we are called both individually and corporately to seek out those who have been lost and bring them back into the fold. In this reading, the parable becomes prescriptive. It's a story about Jesus telling us to do something. And I don't think that reading is necessarily wrong either. I do think Jesus calls us to seek out people who have been lost from a religious or societal or economic perspective. I do think God commands us to go into the world and do things like that. But I also think that this reading leaves something out. First, I think it's a warning sign when we find ourselves in the Jesus spot in these parables. For sure, I think we're called to follow Christ's example, but if all he came to do was set a good example, then he could have stopped after the eating was done. If all this is supposed to be as an example, then the parable has no point. Second, we're usually called to identify with the audience in these things. Jesus, after all, is talking to Pharisees, so we can't really understand what Jesus is talking about unless and until we start to figure out what the Pharisees would agree. So let's talk about the Pharisees. Here over in Christianity, we often substitute in hypocrite when we read Pharisee. We read the Gospels as a grand fight. On one side, the evil empire of the law, as represented by its servants, the wicked Pharisees, and on the other side, the rebel alliance of the new way, in the person of God made flesh and his aides, the disciples. That's just wrong. Jesus, it's critical to remember, was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus arose out of the same rabbinic tradition that the Pharisees did. And in fact, you'll find well-respected Jewish and Christian theologians who are willing to make the argument that Jesus was in fact a Pharisee himself. Those Pharisees were generally well-meaning. Sometimes we see them try to ask tricky questions to trap Jesus in an argument, but isn't that what Christians do to other Christians when we try to flesh out a particularly thorny moral or theological point? And sure, Pharisees had an incomplete view of God's plan for us, and Pharisees made mistakes about how the law should be followed, but I'm unwilling to condemn anyone for having an incomplete view of salvation, or for making mistakes about theological application, because then I'd be condemning myself. Dr. Amy Jo Levine at Vanderbilt recommends thinking about Jesus' use of Pharisee the same way I might use Christian, as someone critiquing a group from inside of the group. So let's think about how the story might have sounded to someone that heard it. Take those tax collectors, for example. Tax collectors agreed to side with an invading and oppressing empire over their own people. And once they had made that choice, they abused their power. They overcharged their neighbors for personal gain. So if you're a Pharisee, tax collectors are not only an example of your own people siding with an empire that restricts your ability to lead a free life, they're also robbing from your neighbors and your friends and your family. And what about those other sinners eating with Jesus? We're not told this, but we can imagine who those people are. They're prostitutes and adulterers, murderers maybe, thieves, people who have renounced their faith for political gain, apostates, heretics, people who the Pharisees would have regarded as unfit for polite society with, and I cannot emphasize this enough, with good reason. I think that's what this parable is about. Jesus is telling his people that God loves, period, full stop. No exceptions, no qualifications, no caveats, no limits. So what exactly does that look like for us? I could end this sermon by talking about how God calls us to embrace and love those whom society has left behind, those who are considered unfit for public life. I could say something like this: Jesus calls us to welcome refugees and immigrants. God's love in our ministry must extend to the people we've incarcerated. I could note that God's love includes the poor and oppressed. I could say that our theology can't exclude people it's historically excluded, like women and minorities and our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And at some churches, that would be good enough. At some churches, that message would be radical and uncomfortable, and I could sit down right now. But I don't think that that message is good enough here. 3 weeks ago, we took up a contribution for an organization that helps refugees and immigrants establish themselves in Middle Tennessee. 2 weeks ago, our liturgy was centered around the language of climate change. Last week, no small part of the homily was devoted to fleshing out how the language of privilege impacts the message Jesus teaches. I love all of those things. That's why I'm here and not somewhere else, because we place an emphasis on identifying systemic injustice, and I think that's morally necessary. But that also means that a sermon about God loving the oppressed isn't exactly radical or challenging at all saints. Jesus doesn't tell the Pharisees, yeah, y'all have it right, keep on going. And so he doesn't tell us that either. I think I'd be doing us all a disservice if we left feeling affirmed and justified and comfortable.
That's right.
So now, let's think like Pharisees. Think about the people you hate for good reason. Think about the people who make the lives of the people God calls us to love worse. Think about the people who are responsible for the economic and racial injustice we see every day. Think about the people you see who day in and day out demonize refugees and immigrants for personal or political gain. Think about the people who co-opt Jesus' name as a means of oppression. Think about the people who make this world worse. We know their names. Think about them. As I was writing this, I wanted to include some caveats. Something like, well, the metaphor is inadequate because you have to want God to come find you, and the people we hate don't want God's love. Or, well, this doesn't mean God condones tax collecting or prostitution or whatever the people I hate do. I think those are fair points, but Jesus doesn't make any of them in the text we read. It's good to hate racism and demagoguery. It's good to fight against oppressive powers, and it's good to demand that the people we live near live lives that uphold the common good. The Pharisees, though, they did that. They saw people whose sins were so grievous, so harmful, that no one could possibly find community with them. We see people like that today, too. Jesus' message is that God loves those people. Those people, the ones we hate and shun with good reason, are the people God leaves the rest of us to go out and find. Those people are Jesus' dinner partners. Those people are God's prized sheep. Those people get angels rejoicing in the heavens, while the rest of us, those 99 righteous people, we get left out in the desert. If that's a little harder, then good. It's supposed to be. Part of the danger of being a church that, in my estimation, gets it right more is that we sometimes feel like being right is enough, and it's not. Regardless of how well we do Christ's work, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, setting loose the chains of bondage, the goal never changes. Christ calls us to look at the people we despise most and say, God's love is visited upon you as well. Full stop. Amen.
Amen.